In the year 1899, the winds of Montana carried more than dust across the endless plains. Behind the tall grass and weathered barns, there was a story no one dared to speak aloud. A story about a family so deeply hidden in the shadows of their own bloodline that truth and shame blurred together. In an isolated valley where neighbors were scarce and silence hung heavier than the mountains themselves, whispers spread of sisters who were no longer just daughters. They had become wives to their very own brothers and even to their fathers. At first, such rumors seemed impossible. Outsiders dismissed them as exaggerations, tales invented by jealous ranchers or bitter settlers who resented the family's stubborn independence. But as the century came to an end, and the towns of Montana grew louder with the arrival of railroads and progress, this hidden corner of the state remained eerily quiet. Few dared to visit, and those who did often returned unsettled, claiming they had seen things in the faces of the children that were better left unspoken. What makes this story unforgettable is not only the shocking truth of what happened inside that secluded home, but also how it was allowed to fester in silence for decades. How could such relationships take root? How did a family descend into a cycle so dark that it still echoes through local memory? And what does it reveal about the dangers of isolation, secrecy, and unchecked power within the walls of a single household? Tonight, you will hear the story of Montana's darkest inbred bloodline. You will walk with us through the creaking wooden floors of their home, past the closed doors where secrets were kept, and into the lives of sisters forced into roles that defied morality, law, and nature itself. The truth will be revealed layer by layer, and by the end, the weight of their choices and the silence of those who looked away will leave you questioning how far human beings can go when trapped in isolation. Stay with us until the end of this story, because the revelations we will uncover are not only shocking, they are unforgettable. If this kind of story grips you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like so we can continue bringing you the darkest and most hidden tales from history. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments, from which city are you watching this video? Your presence here makes this journey even more powerful. The road to the family's homestead was not marked on any official map. It was little more than a trail, carved by years of wagon wheels grinding through mud and stone, and often erased entirely when Montana's storms washed over the land. The journey to reach the property itself already carried a sense of foreboding. Travelers described how the prairie seemed to stretch endlessly until the land dipped into a valley that felt forgotten by time. There, hidden behind clusters of pine trees and a crooked wooden fence, stood a house that was more fortress than home. The structure was large by frontier standards, but its size only made its decay more noticeable. Wooden planks warped from years of harsh winters, windows patched with rags instead of glass, and a roof weighed down by tarps that had long since lost their battle with the wind. The porch sagged, groaning under every step as though warning visitors to turn back. Yet it was not only the condition of the house that left people uneasy, it was the silence that surrounded it. No chickens scratching at the dirt, no cattle grazing the fields, not even the bark of a dog. The land felt hollow, as if stripped of ordinary life. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of kerosene and damp wood. The floors were bare, save for a few threadbare rugs that looked as though they had once belonged to another era. Lanterns flickered weakly against the walls, casting long, uneven shadows across faces that seemed to carry both weariness and suspicion. When strangers arrived, they were greeted without warmth. A man, broad-shouldered but hunched from years of labor, stood watchful at the doorway. His eyes revealed little, but the firm grip on his belt suggested that outsiders were not welcome. Behind him, women moved silently. Their dresses were plain, faded from countless washes, and their hair pulled tightly back as though neatness was the only shield they had left. There were no introductions, no gestures of hospitality. Instead, visitors often reported being studied, as if every word, every glance was measured and weighed before it could pass. The isolation of the family was not just physical, it was cultural. While nearby towns began adopting the rhythms of modern life, schools, churches, and small stores bustling with gossip and trade, this family remained sealed away, living by customs that belonged to an older, harsher age. Marriages, it was whispered, were not celebrated with joy but arranged with secrecy. Children were born not into community, but into silence, hidden behind the valley's walls of pine and suspicion. Those who came close enough to step onto the porch or even into the home often left quickly. They spoke of a heaviness in the air, of eyes that followed them until they disappeared back up the trail. And though no accusations were spoken aloud, the feeling lingered. Something unnatural had taken root here, growing quietly under the weight of generations. From the very first moments spent inside the homestead, the uneasiness deepened. At a glance, the family appeared ordinary enough, farmers hardened by the relentless seasons of Montana. Yet, as time stretched, the details began to reveal themselves in ways that were impossible to ignore. The children were the first clue. Their faces carried a strange symmetry, but not the kind that comes from beauty. It was a harsh sameness, as though the lines of their features had been drawn too close together. Some bore oddly slanted eyes, others had mouths that never seemed to close fully, and more than one struggled to walk with the balance expected of their age. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their voices were muffled, words slurred in a way that suggested more than shyness. For an outsider, it was clear these were not merely the quirks of a single child, but patterns repeating themselves through the generations. The adults, too, carried signs. Their skin bore a pallor uncommon in those who worked the land, and their bodies seemed worn beyond their years. What should have been the strength of men and women in their 30s looked closer to the weariness of age. Even in silence, their interactions raised questions. A woman who appeared young enough to be a sister leaned on the shoulder of a man who introduced himself as her husband, yet her gaze drifted toward an older man in the room with a familiarity that did not fit the role of father-in-law. There were no words exchanged to clarify, only glances heavy with meaning. At meals, outsiders noted an absence of laughter or casual conversation. Each person ate with a mechanical precision, heads lowered, as though speaking freely carried a risk. The roles of wife, daughter, sister, and mother seemed blurred, interchangeable, as if titles had lost their boundaries within those walls. Even the land spoke of something amiss. A visitor once remarked how the fields around the homestead remained half-tended, with tools scattered and fences left broken. For a family with so many grown hands, neglect of the land made little sense. It was as though the work of survival had been replaced by a different struggle, one not spoken of, but deeply consuming. When neighbors, on rare occasions, crossed paths with the family in town, they whispered about the unnatural quiet that clung to them. The children clung too tightly to their mothers, while the women themselves seemed unwilling to meet the eyes of strangers. And though no words of scandal were spoken aloud, suspicion grew in the pauses, in the heavy silence, and in the way people looked away too quickly when asked about the family by name. The more time one spent in their presence, the more the feeling of secrecy thickened. Something was hidden behind those walls, something far darker than the creaking wood or the cold, flickering lamps could explain. To understand how such a family could descend into silence and secrecy, one must first look at the land itself. Montana in 1899 was a frontier caught between two worlds. Railroads were carving paths across the plains, towns were growing, and commerce was slowly weaving communities together. Yet, in its remote valleys and mountain shadows, there remained pockets untouched by progress, places where families lived as though decades of change had never arrived. The family at the heart of this story had settled in Montana long before the century's end. Records suggest their ancestors came west during the mid-1800s, escaping debts and scandals back east. Rather than integrating with the growing communities of Helena or Missoula, they sought seclusion. They chose a valley distant from rail lines and trading posts, a place where no church bells rang and no schools were built. Their land was fertile enough to sustain them, and so they remained apart, generation after generation, until neighbors began to forget they existed at all. In the absence of outside influence, customs hardened. Marriages that might have connected them to nearby ranches or towns never occurred. Instead, unions were arranged within the family itself, at first between cousins, then more dangerously close. By the time the century neared its close, the lines separating siblings, parents, and children had all but disappeared. For outsiders, it was unthinkable. For those within, it was survival, twisted by isolation into something normalized. Neighbors who occasionally crossed paths with the family spoke of their strangeness in hushed tones. Some recalled seeing the patriarch ride into town for supplies with two young women at his side, neither introduced as wife nor daughter, but treated with an unsettling familiarity that raised more questions than it answered. Others mentioned how the family never attended church services, a rarity in that time when Sunday gatherings were not just religious but social lifelines. Their absence from these communal spaces deepened their mystery, fueling suspicion even before the truth became undeniable. Local records, thin as they were, hinted at tragedy within the family line. Deaths were frequent, often of children who never survived infancy. Illnesses swept through the household without doctors ever being called. Birth certificates were rare, marriages unregistered, and burials conducted quietly on their own land. In an age when communities often prided themselves on keeping meticulous records, this silence was deafening. The wider society of Montana had little means, or perhaps little will, to intervene. Frontier life was built on the idea of minding one's own business, of letting neighbors keep to themselves. Unless trouble spilled beyond a family's fences, most chose not to look too closely. And so, secrecy became the family's shield, their traditions tightening with every generation, even as the physical and emotional toll of their choices grew more visible. By 1899, when whispers turned into questions and questions began demanding answers, the family's history of isolation had already carved a legacy too deep to erase. What remained was the unsettling reality. The cycle had been allowed to flourish not only through their choices, but also through the silence of those around them. As the days passed and more observations were gathered, what began as vague unease sharpened into a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The family's silences, the strange resemblances among the children, and the refusal to speak openly about relationships all pointed toward something darker than mere isolation. One visitor, a traveling schoolteacher who hoped to offer lessons to children in the valley, later recalled how she attempted to record the family members' names. The father, a heavy-set man with stern eyes, gave her a list, but the names repeated themselves with only slight variation. Sons bore nearly identical first names to their uncles, daughters shared names with mothers, and in some cases, birth years overlapped in ways that made little sense. When pressed for clarification, the man grew hostile, accusing her of prying into matters that did not concern her. She left before the week was over, her notes incomplete, but troubling enough to be passed along in whispers when she returned to town. Documents, though scarce, also betrayed contradictions. A county clerk in a nearby settlement had long noted the irregularities. Marriage records that suddenly stopped after a certain year, birth records that appeared late and inconsistently, and unexplained gaps where deaths should have been documented. In one particularly strange case, a child's birth certificate listed the mother as a woman barely 12 years old at the time. When questioned, the family brushed it off as a clerical error, yet errors of this kind seemed to follow them relentlessly. Then there were the physical signs, impossible to ignore. The children's appearances, so alike, so peculiar, became the subject of murmurs in town whenever one was spotted. They all looked carved from the same wood, one shopkeeper remarked, shaking his head as he remembered the hollow eyes and crooked limbs of two boys who came to fetch supplies. Another witness, a farmhand who once sought work at the homestead, spoke of overhearing arguments between the men of the house about who would claim the younger women once they came of age. He fled before sundown, refusing to set foot there again. Stories of missing women also lingered at the edges of the family's history. A cousin from a neighboring ranch supposedly married into the family and was never seen outside the valley again. When her relatives asked questions, they were met with threats and silence. Rumors suggested she died in childbirth, though no grave was ever found. Each fragment on its own could be explained away as hearsay, error, or unfortunate coincidence, but taken together, the picture grew clear. This was not a household merely shaped by hardship or secrecy. It was a place where the natural order of family had been twisted beyond recognition, where titles like father, sister, and husband overlapped until they lost their meaning. For outsiders who began piecing these fragments together, the tension mounted. The question was no longer whether something was wrong inside the homestead. It was how deep the wrongness ran and whether the truth would ever come fully into the light. When whispers began turning into quiet investigations, the family responded with a wall of defiance. Outsiders who asked too many questions quickly found themselves unwelcome. Ranchers passing through were warned never to return. Teachers and preachers who offered guidance were turned away at the door, and anyone pressing further risked threats spoken in tones that left no room for doubt. The men of the house, particularly the patriarch, cultivated a reputation for hostility. He rarely raised his voice, but his presence alone was enough to silence most inquiries. His sons mirrored this demeanor, standing in doorways with arms crossed, their silence more menacing than any shouted refusal. It became clear that this was a family bound not only by blood, but by a collective effort to keep outsiders from piercing their secrets. Local authorities, when faced with scattered reports, hesitated to act. In frontier Montana, resources were limited, and lawmen prioritized cattle thefts, land disputes, and violence that spilled openly into towns. What happened behind the closed doors of an isolated homestead was viewed as private, no matter how unsettling the rumors. When one deputy suggested investigating claims of underage marriages within the family, he was quietly reminded that no church had filed a complaint and no official paperwork existed to pursue. Without records, the law had little to hold on to. Religious leaders also faced barriers. A preacher from a nearby parish once attempted to visit the family, bringing with him a Bible and a plea for the children to be baptized. He was met with a locked gate and cold stares. Later, he confided to his congregation that he felt an evil of silence there, but even he stopped short of public accusations. In a time when reputations could be destroyed by false claims, few dared to attach their names to suspicions without proof. Meanwhile, the family itself seemed to cultivate its own defenses. They controlled access to their land, keeping fences high and paths confusing to strangers. Women rarely appeared in town, and when they did, they kept their eyes down, speaking only in short, rehearsed phrases. Questions about their children or their marriages were met with evasions. "It's our way," or "That's family business." The community's habit of respecting privacy, so ingrained in the culture of the frontier, only deepened the silence. For those who persisted, the resistance turned sharper. One schoolteacher who pressed for the attendance of the younger children claimed she was followed back down the valley by two men on horseback, their presence lingering until she reached safer roads. Another traveler spoke of hearing muffled cries behind shuttered windows, but being told firmly by the patriarch that it was no concern of strangers. These obstacles created a fortress around the family, one not built of stone, but of fear, silence, and calculated isolation. The harder investigators or neighbors pushed, the more dangerous the resistance became. And so the truth remained trapped within the walls of the house, festering in secrecy, while those outside were left only with fragments and uneasy suspicion. The veil of secrecy surrounding the family began to unravel not through official investigation, but through the words of those who had dared to step too close. Their testimonies, scattered across years, painted a picture that was no longer possible to dismiss. One of the earliest came from a farmhand who had been hired during a harsh winter. He stayed only 2 weeks, but his memories lingered for a lifetime. In his account, he spoke of women who never addressed him directly, always lowering their eyes when he entered a room. Meals were silent, and the men never allowed him near the back rooms of the house. But it was the children that haunted him. He recalled a young boy of about 10, frail and struggling to breathe, his chest rising unevenly with each gasp. When the farmhand suggested calling a doctor from town, the patriarch's response was chilling. "Our family takes care of its own." The boy disappeared days later. No burial was ever recorded. Years later, a traveling preacher gave his own testimony. He had attempted to bring the word of God to the valley, but what he found was resistance laced with dread. He described how one of the women, perhaps in her 20s, pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand as he was turned away at the gate. On it was written a single sentence, "No one here is free." Though he reported the incident to local authorities, nothing came of it. The note was dismissed as exaggeration or even hysteria. Then came the discovery of a tattered journal, found decades later in the attic of a nearby ranch, where one of the daughters had briefly lived after marrying into another family. Its pages were filled with desperate entries, fragments of a young woman's voice trapped in cycles of fear. She wrote of children born sickly, of marriages forced upon her sisters, and of a life where love was never separate from obligation. One line stood out: "I cannot tell where father ends and husband begins." Medical records, too, began to confirm suspicions. A doctor in town, known for his discretion, privately noted a troubling pattern. Over the span of a decade, several children brought from the valley showed signs of congenital deformities, club feet, hearing impairments, and cognitive delays. The parents gave vague answers when asked about their lineage, insisting they had no close kin nearby. The doctor, wary of confrontation and lacking legal authority, recorded the anomalies quietly, but his private notes were later unearthed, offering damning evidence. Neighbors contributed their voices as well. One woman, who had once been close friends with a young bride from the valley, recounted how her friend vanished shortly after marrying one of the family's sons. When pressed, the patriarch told her curtly, "She belongs to us now." The woman never saw her friend again. Piece by piece, these testimonies and documents wove together into a picture too coherent to ignore. It was no longer just rumor. The weight of evidence pressed down, revealing that the family's darkest secrets were not only whispered, they were lived, recorded, and suffered by those trapped inside. For years, rumors swirled without resolution, whispers fading into silence as the family retreated deeper into its valley fortress. But at the turn of the century, the truth finally broke into the open. What had once been suspicion became undeniable when a combination of testimony and hard evidence forced the community, and eventually the law, to confront what was happening behind those decaying walls. The breaking point came through a young woman, barely 16, who managed to escape the homestead one freezing night. Malnourished and terrified, she staggered into a nearby town, clutching a bundle of letters she had hidden away for years. In these crumpled pages, written with trembling hands, she detailed the abuse and forced unions she and her sisters endured. She named her father not only as her parent, but as her husband, and her brothers as both siblings and spouses. Each line was more harrowing than the last, laying bare the life of captivity and degradation inside the home. Her words alone might have been dismissed in another time, but she carried proof that no one could deny. The girl had kept birth records, hidden beneath floorboards, showing children born from unions that the outside world considered unthinkable. The names matched the county clerk's suspicious records, dates overlapping in ways that revealed a disturbing pattern. Daughters listed as mothers within months of becoming teenagers. Births recorded under names that shifted depending on who filled out the forms, and entire generations collapsing into one twisted lineage. Doctors who examined the girl added their voices. Her frail condition, the physical scars she bore, and the medical implications of her claims aligned perfectly with the genetic deformities long observed in the children of the valley. What had once been murmured in hushed tones was now confirmed with cold precision. This was not rumor, not exaggeration, but the direct result of systematic incest spanning generations. The revelation sent shockwaves across the region. Neighbors who had turned a blind eye were now forced to confront the weight of their silence. Religious leaders who had avoided conflict condemned the family from their pulpits, and lawmen who once claimed they lacked cause could no longer deny the evidence placed before them. But perhaps most haunting of all was the patriarch's own reaction. When confronted, he did not deny the accusations. Instead, he justified them. In a chilling testimony, he claimed that the outside world had no right to judge, that the family had survived the only way it knew how. His words, meant to defend, only deepened the horror. What had been hidden in the shadows was now dragged into the light. The family's darkest secret, sisters forced into the role of wives, daughters bearing the children of their fathers and brothers, was exposed beyond dispute. The community could no longer whisper. They could only recoil in collective shock, realizing that Montana's most shameful bloodline had been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. When the truth could no longer be hidden, the full weight of the law finally descended upon the family. In early 1900, a trial was convened in the nearest county courthouse, drawing crowds that spilled into the streets. What had once been whispered in shadows was now spoken aloud before judges, jurors, and townspeople, each detail of the family's life dissected under oath. For many, it was the first time they had heard such atrocities articulated without fear or hesitation, and the courtroom carried an atmosphere of both outrage and disbelief. The patriarch, long the unchallenged authority within the homestead, stood accused of crimes that shattered the very fabric of social and moral order: incest, abuse, unlawful marriages, and the corruption of minors. Witnesses came forward one by one, each testimony weaving a damning picture. The escaped daughter spoke with trembling conviction, her words exposing not only her father's acts, but the complicity of her brothers who followed his example. The journal, the hidden birth records, and the medical testimony provided a foundation of evidence that even the most skeptical juror could not dismiss. When the patriarch took the stand, he shocked many with his lack of remorse. He claimed that their way of life was not criminal but family tradition, an argument that only deepened the disgust in the room. His sons remained largely silent, avoiding eye contact with the crowd, while the women of the household, those who had lived through years of oppression, sat in silence, torn between fear and the faint hope that truth might finally free them. The verdict came swiftly. The patriarch was sentenced to life imprisonment, a rare and severe punishment at the time, reflecting the gravity of his crimes. Several of his sons received lesser sentences, but were still condemned for their participation in unlawful unions and abuse. Yet the justice system of the era was not fully equipped to handle the scope of the case. Many of the women, though seen as victims, were also judged harshly by parts of the community, whispered about as though they shared blame for their silence. The trial also revealed the failures of the institutions that had long ignored the warning signs. The church, criticized for avoiding confrontation, admitted in hindsight that their reluctance had cost lives. Local law enforcement faced scrutiny for years of inaction, their defense being that without official complaints, they lacked grounds to intervene. For the community, these revelations stung deeply. The family's crimes had thrived not only because of secrecy, but because neighbors, officials, and leaders chose not to see. In the aftermath, reforms were discussed. County clerks tightened their record-keeping, ensuring that marriages and births were more carefully monitored. Doctors were urged to report suspected abuse rather than remain silent. Churches became more active in outreach to isolated families, determined not to let such darkness take root again. Still, the scars remain. The family's name, once obscure, became infamous across Montana. For years afterward, townspeople spoke of the case in hushed tones, as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of how silence can enable unspeakable wrongs. In the years following the trial, the remnants of the family scattered like broken branches from a tree long rotted at its core. Some of the younger children, too young to be implicated or fully understand the nature of what had surrounded them, were placed in the care of distant relatives or charitable institutions. For many, the adjustment to a world beyond the valley was jarring. They carried not only the scars of poverty and neglect, but also the heavy burden of a name that now evoked shame wherever it was spoken. The women who had been trapped for so long faced an equally uncertain future. Some remained in Montana under new identities, attempting to carve lives apart from the stigma of their past. Others disappeared entirely, moving eastward or southward, never to be heard from again. For them, freedom was fragile. Though the law had named them victims, society often treated them with suspicion, unable or unwilling to separate the horrors they endured from the roles they had been forced to play. The patriarch's death in prison came within a decade, his decline hastened by age and illness. His passing was not mourned, not even by those bound to him by blood. His sons, serving their own terms behind bars, faded into obscurity. Their absence from the land they once ruled marked the end of the bloodline's dominance, but the valley where their house stood remained a place of unease. The home itself, abandoned after the trial, slowly collapsed under snow and storms until it became nothing more than a skeleton of wood and stone, a physical reminder of a past too dark to preserve. The wider impact of the case rippled through Montana and beyond. Communities that had long practiced strict privacy began to reckon with the dangers of silence. Clerks and doctors, once hesitant to interfere in family matters, adopted new responsibilities to report signs of abuse. Churches that had looked away vowed to bring their message into the farthest homesteads, determined never again to let isolation fester into something unspeakable. But perhaps the greatest legacy was the caution it instilled in the public conscience. Newspapers recounted the story for years, retelling it as a warning of what can happen when secrecy hardens into tradition and when isolation shields wrongdoing from the light of accountability. The family became a grim lesson in how human bonds, when twisted by power and silence, can turn into shackles rather than support. As the century moved forward and Montana grew into a more connected state, the story of the valley served as both a scar and a reminder. It revealed the fragility of human morality when cut off from community, the dangers of silence when suspicion goes unspoken, and the devastating cost of secrets guarded too fiercely. Even now, more than a century later, the tragedy remains a whisper in Montana's history, a dark echo reminding us that what is hidden behind closed doors can shape not only a family, but an entire community. And it leaves us with a question that lingers long after the story ends. How many other valleys, how many other families once held secrets that the world never uncovered?